My name is Teresa Caldwell. I'm 68 years old, a retired accountant, and until a few weeks ago, I was the quiet wife of a man everyone in Newport seemed to respect. When my husband, Martin, passed away, people whispered words like dignified and graceful as they looked at me, standing by his coffin. But they didn't know that while they offered sympathy, I held something far heavier than grief in my hands. The silence of a secret worth $35 million. It was a clear coastal morning when we buried him, the kind of day when the ocean looked too calm for mourning. Guests filled the chapel with polite sadness, and I could almost hear the sound of their restraint. My daughter, Lauren, stood at the front with her husband, Nate Pierce, the man who would later look me in the eye and tell me I had no place left in my own home. At the time, he wore a face of practiced sorrow. His hand rested on my daughter's back, guiding her like a stage cue. I saw through it, of course. Years of balancing other people's accounts had taught me how to read debts, financial and moral alike. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you once called family, you'll understand why I stayed so still that morning. Sometimes silence is not weakness, it's a blueprint. And if you're listening now, stay with me till the end, because this story isn't about revenge. It's about design, patience, and the quiet power of knowing when to let the ink dry before you speak. They lowered the casket while gulls circled above the cliffs. My neighbor Eloise whispered, "He built lighthouses, didn't he?" I nodded. Martin had always said a good lighthouse doesn't save ships by shouting, it saves them by standing steady. That thought kept me from trembling when Nate came up to me afterward, his voice too soft to be kind. "You have no place here anymore," he said. His words sliced through the air, sharp but careful enough to draw no witnesses. Lauren looked away, pretending to adjust her shawl. A few guests watched us from a distance, unaware that this single sentence would start a quiet storm. I didn't answer him. I didn't cry. I simply slipped my hand into my coat pocket and felt the cool edge of Martin's brass compass. Inside it was folded a tiny note written in his hand. "Wait until ink can speak." I pressed my thumb against the lid and whispered the only word I could manage. "Okay." People would later say I looked calm that day, almost detached. They couldn't see the truth, how my silence sealed every door I intended to reopen on my own terms. While they thought the widow was lost, I was already measuring the distance between grief and justice. Every woman who has ever been underestimated knows that feeling. The moment you realize silence can build walls stronger than words. The reception afterward was held in our coastal home, the one Martin and I had spent 3 decades restoring, plank by plank. Guests filled the parlor with stories and polite laughter, unaware that the house itself held the keys to something no one but me knew existed. I listened to their condolences, nodding, keeping my breath even, each word calculated like an old habit. Years of accounting had taught me that the balance sheet of life rarely adds up cleanly. There are always hidden lines, assets that don't appear until someone reads the fine print. Nate stood near the fireplace, talking about the renovations he wanted to make. "We'll modernize it," he told Lauren, loud enough for me to hear. "It's too dated for resale." His tone was the same one he used when he spoke to restaurant investors. Smooth, convincing, hollow. I looked at my daughter, hoping to see a flicker of hesitation. She only smiled weakly, the way people do when they're afraid to choose sides. I walked to the window overlooking the harbor. The sea breeze carried a faint scent of thyme and salt. Somewhere below, a gull cried once, sharp and lonely. I opened my palm and saw the faint reflection of the compass against my skin. The brass had darkened with age, but the initials MC were still visible. Beneath it lay a small ring of antique keys, tied together with a thin piece of red ribbon. No one noticed when I closed my fingers around them. Martin used to say, "Measure twice, speak once." It was a phrase I'd heard so many times it had lost its weight. Until that day. Because the truth was, Martin had prepared for everything, even his own absence. He believed in paper more than promises. Every trust, every deed, every clause had been signed and sealed in ways few people understood. And I, the quiet wife everyone assumed knew nothing, had helped design it all. Later that evening, when the last car pulled away and the house fell silent, I walked through each room alone. The photographs on the wall watched me pass. The air smelled of flowers and salt. I stopped by Martin's study and ran my hand across his old drafting table. There were still ink stains where he used to sketch lighthouse beams. Next to the compass sat a small envelope addressed only to me. I didn't open it, not yet. Some things need time, and some truths need silence before they can be heard. In the stillness of that first night without him, I understood the weight of what I carried. The $35 million hidden in trust documents, the true deed to this house, the power of the keys in my pocket. All of it meant nothing if handled in anger. So I chose stillness. I chose patience. I chose to let the ink speak before I ever did. By morning, the town would wake to gossip about the funeral and the widow who didn't cry. They would not know that beneath that calm exterior, I had already begun to calculate the quietest form of justice there is, one written on paper, sealed with wax, and carried out by silence. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that hums in your ears until you start hearing memories. I rose before dawn, put on my old cardigan, and walked down the stone path behind the main house. The air smelled of wet cedar and the sea. Past the hedges and the wilted peonies stood the carriage house, the small studio Martin used to call his sanctuary of logic. The brass keys in my pocket clinked softly. I found the one with the little notch on its stem and turned it in the old iron lock. The door opened with a sigh, as if it too had been waiting for me. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. Blueprints rolled into tubes, stacks of parchment, the faint aroma of ink and machine oil. I switched on the small desk lamp, and the room glowed amber, revealing a thin layer of dust over the drafting table. I sat down and opened the bottom drawer. There, beneath old invoices and ink pens, lay a black leather folder labeled Caldwell Family Irrevocable Trust. The seal was unbroken. My hands shook slightly as I opened it. Page after page bore Martin's handwriting beside the attorney's formal language. He had left $35 million in trust, all titled under my name. It was protected by something unusual, a clause requiring 2 independent physicians to certify my mental competence before anyone could challenge my authority. That alone was enough to make me exhale a long, steady breath. He had built a fortress made of signatures and foresight. Underneath the documents was a thin brass compass, the same one from my pocket, but this one was older, heavier, engraved with our initials entwined. I realized then that the one I had been holding all along was a duplicate. When I opened it, a folded slip of paper fluttered out. Martin's handwriting covered it in ink slightly smudged by time. Wait until ink can speak. I read it twice, hearing his calm voice in my mind, the same tone he used when he explained structural balance in architecture. He believed everything, trusts, buildings, marriages, needed tension to stand. I turned to the wall where his framed sketches hung. Hidden behind one was a large diagram marked with red wax pencil, 3 interconnected circles labeled Recorder, Bank, and Health. In the center, he'd drawn a small lighthouse and written my name beneath it. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was an instruction, a map of power. The Recorder stood for property deeds, the Bank for financial control, and Health for medical authority. Together they formed what Martin once called the triple anchor. I traced each circle with my finger, realizing he had left me more than wealth. He had left me a plan. I opened the safe beneath the table. Inside were deeds, certificates, and something wrapped in parchment, a sealed letter from Victor Henley, Martin's oldest friend and attorney. I broke the wax carefully. The letter was dated 3 months before Martin's death. It said, "Teresa, when the time comes, call me. You'll know when. There will be noise. Let it pass. Then move quietly." The design is sound. Under his name was a phone number written in fading ink. Outside, the morning light had begun to touch the water. The sound of distant gulls echoed through the half-open window. I thought of Nate's words, "You have no place here anymore," and how quickly people forget who holds the real keys. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was the slow, deliberate pulse of purpose returning to my chest. For years, I had been the silent half of a partnership built on precision. Now it was my turn to finish the design. I gathered the documents, the compass, the duplicate keys, and placed them neatly into a leather satchel. Then I sat for a long while, listening to the rhythmic drip from the gutter outside. It reminded me of a metronome keeping time for the life that was about to begin again. When the clock struck 8, I locked the carriage house and turned toward the main house. The light on the horizon had shifted from silver to gold. I paused at the threshold, looking back at the quiet building that had guarded our secrets for decades. For the first time since the funeral, I whispered to the empty air, "All right, Martin. The ink has spoken." Inside the house, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the kitchen window. Lauren had texted a brief message. "Hope you're resting, Mom." I typed back, "I am. Tell Nate I'll handle the estate paperwork myself." I could almost hear the tension that message would cause, and the thought steadied me more than caffeine ever could. On the counter lay the compass, catching the morning light. The needle pointed north, trembling slightly as if impatient. I took out Victor's letter again, folded it precisely, and tucked it into my wallet. There would be time for grief later, perhaps when the sea was calm enough for it. For now, there were signatures to protect, documents to secure, and a legacy to honor, not by speaking, but by executing. 2 days after the funeral, I found Nate waiting for me on the porch. He wore one of Martin's old windbreakers, as if the borrowed fabric might grant him authority. The morning light fell across his face, revealing a tension that no sympathy could hide. Lauren stood a few feet behind him, arms folded, eyes uncertain. It felt like a scene rehearsed in private, and I was expected to play my part as the fragile widow. "Teresa," Nate began, using my first name as though we were business partners. "We need to discuss the estate. Lauren and I have been handling the calls, and the bank says they'll need updated authorization." I looked at him, then at my daughter. Lauren's gaze flickered toward the gravel driveway. "It's just routine, Mom," she murmured, almost apologetic. "They said it's easier if everything is under one name for now." I smiled faintly, not from warmth, but from recognition. I'd spent 40 years reading numbers, contracts, and faces. This was the kind of sentence that always came before someone tried to move, something that wasn't theirs. I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the small ring of antique keys. The brass was warm from my skin, and one of them, an old gate key, had no lock anymore. "I see," I said quietly. "And whose name would that be?" Nate didn't hesitate. "Ours. Lauren and I will keep things organized while you take time for yourself. It's what Martin would have wanted." His smile was tight, rehearsed, a salesman's smile. Lauren's voice trembled. "It's only temporary, Mom." I walked past them and leaned against the porch railing. The sea shimmered beyond the dunes, calm and endless. You know, I said softly, your father used to say a key is only powerful if it opens the right door. Otherwise, it's just metal. I turned and held out the ring of keys. Here, you should have these. Nate's eyes lit up for the briefest moment as he reached out. I placed the keys in his palm, the old gate key on top, its teeth worn smooth. He looked at them, then at me. These are for the house? They open something, I said. Measure twice, speak once. Lauren's breath caught, as if she wasn't sure whether to laugh or question me. Nate pocketed the keys with a triumphant nod. Thank you, Teresa. That's very trusting of you. Of course, I replied, keeping my tone even. Trust is important in families. After they left, I watched their car disappear down the coastal road. Only when the taillights vanished did I allow myself to exhale. I walked back inside, locked the real keys, the ones to the safe, the carriage house, and the trust documents, inside a drawer beneath Martin's desk. Then I sat down and let the quiet return, the kind of silence that feels like armor. The afternoon drifted by slowly. The house creaked with its usual rhythm, the pipes humming faintly like an old song. Around sunset, I heard footsteps in the garden. It was Eloise, my neighbor, carrying a small basket of scones. You've had visitors, she said knowingly, setting the basket down. Family, I answered. She nodded. That kind of visit? I smiled, weary, but calm. Exactly that kind. Eloise looked around the parlor, then lowered her voice. You're handling it better than most would. Numbers have a way of teaching patience, I said, and silence has a way of teaching precision. She touched my shoulder. You always did know how to keep things measured. When she left, the sky had turned a deep indigo. I stood at the window and watched the lanterns flicker along the harbor. Somewhere in the distance, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and thyme through the open window. I reached into my pocket out of habit, forgetting that the keys were gone. My fingers brushed against the compass instead. Its lid clicked open, and the needle pointed true north, unwavering. I imagined Nate standing in his car later, trying each of those keys in the gates and doors, realizing none fit. I could almost hear the frustration in his breath, the sound of metal scraping against the wrong lock. I poured myself a cup of tea, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his arrogance had already been met with boundaries he didn't even see coming. When Lauren called that evening, her voice was gentle but strained. Mom, I think you gave Nate the wrong set of keys. Did I? I said simply. There was a pause. He couldn't open the gate. He thinks maybe you forgot which ones are current. Tell him I'll look into it tomorrow. She hesitated again. You're not angry? No, I said, letting the words settle. Anger is noisy. I prefer silence. After the call ended, I turned off the lights one by one until only the soft glow from Martin's study remained. I looked around the room and whispered to the stillness, measure twice, speak once. The words felt heavier now, like they had found their true purpose. The night air moved through the curtains, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to peace. Not comfort, not relief, but the calm before a design takes shape. The next morning began with a sound that had become rare in the house, the steady ring of the landline phone. It startled me at first. Few people called anymore. The display showed a number I hadn't seen in years, but I knew it by heart. Victor Henley. I had written his name in the margin of every document Martin and I had ever signed. I took a deep breath before answering. Good morning, Victor. There was a pause, then his familiar, gravelly voice. Teresa, I was wondering how long it would take for you to find that letter. I glanced toward the carriage house through the kitchen window, sunlight glinting off its glass panes. I waited until the noise passed, I said. He exhaled, the sound of paper shuffling on his end. Martin always said you'd know when to call. He designed everything to activate in 3 stages: recorder, bank, and health. You'll need each of them within 2 weeks. 14 days before anyone can file to override your authority. 14 days, I repeated softly. The number settled in my mind like a quiet clock starting to tick. Victor's tone was calm but precise. We'll start with Clara Quinn at Harbor Bank. She runs compliance. She'll make sure the trust remains locked under your name. I'll contact her before noon, and she'll expect your visit. Don't mention the estate to anyone until it's complete. And, Teresa? Yes. Silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. Keep it steady. I smiled faintly. That's always been my language. When the call ended, I sat there for a long moment, letting the stillness return. The faint hum of the refrigerator sounded like the slow winding of a clock. I opened the small drawer beneath the counter and found the red ribbon where I'd kept the real keys. They glinted under the morning light, the brass edges dulled by age but still solid. I slipped them into my pocket and wrote a note to myself on a scrap of paper. Victor, 14 days. Clara, recorder later. I folded it twice and placed it inside the compass case. Outside, the sea breeze was brisk, carrying the scent of salt and wet sand. The garden still held remnants of the funeral flowers, peonies bending under their own weight. I gathered the withered stems and laid them beside the fence, their white petals catching in the grass like bits of paper. Then I locked the main gate, testing each key as I did, listening to the click of the metal sliding into place. Around noon, Lauren came by. Her voice was soft, uncertain. Mom, Nate thinks we should meet with his lawyer this week, just to review some of the estate papers. He says it'll protect everyone involved. Does he? I asked. She nodded quickly. He's just trying to help. I studied her face for a moment, the tired eyes, the way she bit her lip before speaking. I recognized the same hesitation I once had when I wanted to believe in someone more than their actions deserved. Lauren, I said, my tone even. Your father believed in fairness. He built everything on balance. Tell Nate I appreciate his concern, but I'll be handling the documents directly with our attorney. She looked at me, searching for an explanation. You mean Victor? Yes. Her expression softened a little. You still trust him? I trust what your father trusted, I said. That's enough. When she left, I stood by the doorway, watching her drive away. The compass rested on the table beside the letter from Victor, its needle trembling toward north as though it felt the pressure of time. I ran my finger along the brass rim and whispered, 14 days. That evening, I sat by the fireplace, sorting through a stack of envelopes Martin had labeled years ago. One was marked Health Directive. Inside were 2 contact names, Dr. Priya Mehta and Dr. James Leland. Both had signed off on the capacity clause embedded in the trust. Martin had planned every detail down to the signatures that would protect me. The thought steadied me. For the first time since his death, I felt less like a widow and more like a guardian of something living, something he had designed to outlast us both. As the fire crackled, I picked up the phone and dialed the number Victor had given me for Clara Quinn. The line rang once, twice, then a calm, professional voice answered. This is Clara. This is Teresa Caldwell. Victor asked me to reach out. I've been expecting your call, she said. I reviewed the trust structure last night. Your husband was meticulous. We'll meet tomorrow morning at Harbor Bank. Bring your identification and your keys. I'll take care of the rest. Her confidence reminded me of Martin's. Thank you, Clara. One more thing, she added. Once we start, there'll be no interruptions. 14 days is not long. I understand. After the call ended, I looked around the house. Every wall seemed to carry his handwriting, every floorboard his precision. The tide outside was rising, brushing against the seawall in slow, rhythmic waves. I placed the compass on the mantel, right above the spot where Martin used to stand when he spoke about his projects. For a moment, the reflection of the flame danced across its glass cover, making it look alive. In the silence that followed, I made a quiet vow to myself. No raised voices, no arguments, no public drama, only structure, timing, and the calm authority that had always been my strength. The countdown had begun, and the first line of defense was already in motion. Saturday morning brought sunlight sharp enough to sting. Newport's harbor market was crowded, full of chatter and the scent of coffee, sea salt, and fresh bread. I hadn't planned to go, but the house felt too heavy, too full of silence pressing on itself. Sometimes it helps to step outside and let the world speak around you. I walked through rows of white tents, past baskets of thyme and jars of honey, until I reached the flower stand where the peonies were already fading. The woman behind the counter recognized me and lowered her voice out of habit. "I was sorry to hear about Martin," she said. "He built the lighthouse by Breaker's Point, didn't he?" "Yes," I answered, touching the petals. "He believed every light should face the storm." She smiled sadly. "You must be proud." "I am," I said. "Even now." Across the way, I noticed Deborah Pierce standing near the bakery stall, her silver hair pinned tight, pearls at her throat. Nate's mother never looked unkempt, even on market days. Her eyes found me almost immediately, and she hesitated before approaching. "Teresa," she said, forcing a smile. "You look well." "I manage," I replied. "How's your son?" She sighed, as though the weight of his troubles were a private burden. "Worried, of course. You know how men can be when business turns rough. The restaurant expansion hasn't been kind to him. Too many investors, too few returns." I kept my expression neutral. "I'm sure he'll find his balance." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "He's trying, but it's humiliating when people in town start whispering. You of all people understand reputation. Sometimes family must do what's necessary to protect itself." "I do understand reputation," I said, picking up a single peony. "And I've learned that protection doesn't always mean control." Deborah's lips pressed together in a polite smile. "Still, it would mean a lot to Nate if things were simplified. He feels responsible for Lauren's future. You know how young couples are. Overly ambitious. Ambition can be useful," I said, "if it's honest." Her hand tightened around her handbag. "Teresa, surely you don't intend to handle all that paperwork alone. The estate, the trust, the deed, it's exhausting. Let the younger generation take it. That's what Martin would have wanted." I looked her straight in the eye, my voice calm. Martin wanted fairness. He built systems, not shortcuts. Her composure wavered for half a second, just long enough for me to see the unease beneath the pearls. She leaned closer, lowering her voice until it was barely more than a whisper. "Be careful, Teresa. Silence can look like weakness to people who don't understand it." I smiled gently. "Then it's their misunderstanding, not mine." She blinked, uncertain, then turned away toward the bakery stand. I watched her speak to the vendor, her gestures brisk, her mask already back in place. In my hand, the peony drooped slightly, its petals soft and fragrant. I bought a single stem, white as seafoam, and carried it with me through the crowd. At the post office corner, I stopped to address a thick envelope I had prepared the night before. Official documents Victor had drafted for me to send to the county recorder. On the front, I wrote, "Reclaiming ground" in the memo line, just as Martin once labeled every major file in his career. Inside, the clerk handed me a sheet of postage stamps, each printed with a small lighthouse. I peeled one off and pressed it carefully onto the envelope. The adhesive made a quiet clack under my thumb. "Certified mail, please," I said. As the clerk stamped the seal with a heavy thud, I thought about Deborah's whisper and Nate's hidden debts. The sound of the stamp felt like punctuation, final and undeniable. Paper has a way of carrying truth longer than conversation ever could. When I stepped back outside, the wind lifted my hair, bringing with it the tang of the Atlantic. Across the street, Deborah's car pulled away from the curb. Through the window, I saw her turn her head just slightly, her expression unreadable. I knew she'd tell Nate about this encounter, and I knew exactly what he would think, that the widow had gone to the post office for sympathy cards, not certified filings. Let them think so. I walked home slowly, the envelope's receipt folded neatly in my pocket, the peony stem cradled in my hand. At the gate, I paused to look at the horizon where the ocean met the sky, a straight line of balance and restraint. Somewhere beneath that calm surface, I imagined the quiet machinery of law beginning to turn, the trust, the deed, the record. When I reached the porch, I placed the peony in a small glass jar beside the compass. Its reflection shimmered against the brass, white petals glowing in the dim afternoon light. I took out my notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of the page. Silence signs louder than words. Then, below it, I wrote today's date and circled the number 2 in red ink. Day 2 of 14. The next morning, I dressed carefully, a navy coat, plain pearl earrings, and the quiet steadiness that had become my armor. The fog still clung to the harbor as I drove toward Harbor Bank, the same institution where Martin and I had opened our first account 40 years ago. The brass letters on the building's facade gleamed faintly through the mist. Inside, the lobby smelled of polished wood and paper. Everything was hushed except for the soft shuffle of documents and the rhythmic click of heels on marble. A receptionist led me to a glass-walled office where a woman stood waiting beside a stack of folders. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said warmly. "I'm Clara Quinn. Victor told me you'd come." Her presence was calm but firm, the kind of composure born from long years of dealing with other people's money. She gestured for me to sit, then closed the door behind us. "Your husband was meticulous," she said. "He left quite a structure. We'll make sure it remains intact." I nodded. That's what he would have wanted. Clara opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. "This is your Trust Compliance Directive. It restricts any attempt to alter, merge, or override the existing accounts without in-person authentication from you and 2 witnesses. Once executed, it will override any power of attorney claims, past or present." I scanned the pages slowly. Every clause was familiar, language Martin and I had drafted together years ago, language precise enough to outlast emotion. "You've reviewed recent activity?" I asked. Clara's expression shifted slightly. "Yes. 2 days ago, a request came from a secondary counsel representing Nathan Pierce. He tried to initiate a change of correspondence address and beneficiary access. It was flagged as irregular." My pulse remained even. "And what happened to that request?" "It was suspended," she said, tapping the page. "Nothing moves without your signature. I wanted you to see it before it disappears entirely from the record. Sometimes erasing a footprint too quickly only invites more suspicion." I met her eyes. "Then let it stay. Some footprints are useful reminders." Clara smiled faintly, the corner of her mouth lifting. "Very well. Let's set this directive. You'll sign here, and I'll authenticate in system. 2 witnesses from compliance will verify the process." A moment later, 2 clerks entered quietly, observed, and signed. The printer hummed, producing copies that smelled faintly of warm ink. I placed my initials beside the embossed seal. Clara pressed a button on her keyboard, and a soft chime confirmed the update. "There," she said. "From this moment, your financial perimeter is locked. Not even an emergency petition can override it." I folded my copy neatly into my bag. "Martin used to say structure is freedom." She nodded thoughtfully. "He was right. Systems only seem rigid until they protect you." When I stood to leave, Clara added, "Mrs. Caldwell, there's one more thing. I'll place a compliance alert on your trust account. An internal note. If anyone tries to access it, my office will know before the request reaches a manager. You'll receive a discreet notification." "Thank you," I said. "I prefer to know when the tide turns." Outside, the fog had lifted into pale sunlight. I walked slowly down the steps, the wind lifting my hair, the salt air sharp and clean. I paused by the edge of the parking lot, looking out toward the water. Somewhere behind me, a door closed with a low click, the sound of security settling into place. Back home, I made tea and set the documents beside the compass on Martin's desk. The brass needle quivered, steadying as the house fell quiet. I opened my notebook and wrote down the words, "Directive set. Bank sealed." At dusk, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is Clara." There was an attempted access again. Same counsel, different timestamp. The system blocked it automatically. "You're safe." I typed back, "Thank you, Clara. I'll stay silent and let the ink speak." Her reply came seconds later. "That's how true compliance works." I closed the phone and turned toward the window. The sea reflected the last light of evening, each wave catching a faint glimmer like the edge of paper under a lamp. I thought of Nate, somewhere drafting plans he believed would succeed, unaware that the structure beneath him had already shifted. As the tide reached the seawall, I whispered, 3 days down, 11 to go." The house answered with its own kind of quiet, steady, deliberate, and unbreakable. By the end of the week, Lauren called to say there would be a small gathering at their home. A remodel announcement, she called it. The words were polite, but her tone was uneasy. I knew it wasn't really about renovations. It was a performance, and I was meant to be the silent audience. When I arrived that Saturday evening, the coastal air had turned crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt and thyme from the dunes. Their house glowed with expensive lighting, glass doors open to the terrace, music drifting from a hired quartet. The kind of event that looked effortless but cost more than it appeared. I stood at the entrance, feeling the chill of the sea on my skin, watching guests mingle with champagne flutes and shallow smiles. Lauren met me halfway down the hall, nervous but radiant. "Mom, you came," she said softly, kissing my cheek. "Nate wanted you here. It's important to him." "I can imagine," I said. "Where is he?" She hesitated, then glanced toward the terrace. "Outside with the investors. He wants to announce the expansion plans. He says it's what Dad would have wanted, to build something lasting." I looked at her carefully. "Your father built lighthouses, not gastropubs." Her smile faltered. "Please, Mom, just try to be pleasant." I touched her arm. "I always am." The music softened as Nate appeared on the terrace, his voice rising with confidence. "To new beginnings," he said, lifting his glass. "To family legacies and the next chapter of this home." The guests applauded politely. Beside him stood Deborah, her pearls catching the light, her smile sharp. I stepped forward quietly, unnoticed at first. On the buffet table, someone had arranged white peonies in tall vases, their scent sweet but heavy. I plucked one from the bouquet and carried it toward the champagne tower. the sound of glasses chiming faintly as I set the flower at its base. Conversations paused for a moment. Nate turned, his expression tightening as he saw me. "I didn't realize you'd made it," he said, voice taut behind his charm. "I wouldn't miss it," I said. "It's a lovely party. Lauren worked hard on it." "I can tell." I let my eyes sweep the room, every guest watching the exchange. Then I said, calmly but clearly, "You've chosen a fine space for celebration. After all, it's still part of my home." The silence that followed was immediate and deep. Someone's laughter caught in their throat. Deborah's smile froze mid-gesture. Nate's eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry?" "My name," I said, still smiling, "is on the deed. Every inch of this property rests on that fact." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The sound of waves outside filled the void. I could feel the weight of their gaze, the neighbors, the investors, even Lauren. Then I stepped back, brushing a stray petal from my sleeve. "Don't let me interrupt. Please continue." I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, whispers rose like a tide. I caught Eloise's voice. She must have been among the guests, softly murmuring, "Good for her." Outside, the air was cold and bracing. I breathed deeply, the sea wind cooling my nerves. From the terrace, I could still hear Nate trying to recover his footing, making jokes, assuring the crowd everything was fine. But I knew the humiliation had landed. A man like Nate didn't fear failure as much as he feared public silence in the space after a truth was spoken. When I reached my car, I looked back once more. Through the glass, I saw Lauren standing apart from her husband, her face pale, her expression torn between loyalty and awakening. She wasn't ready yet, but she had heard the crack in his story, the sound of glass under pressure. At home, I set the remaining peony from the party beside the compass on Martin's desk. Its petals were slightly bruised but still fragrant. I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence. Public silence can be louder than any accusation. The night deepened outside, and for the first time, the house felt different, stronger, as if it understood that words, once measured and released, could shift entire rooms. I poured a small glass of wine, lifted it toward the window where the sea glimmered in the moonlight, and whispered, 10 days left. The morning after the party, the house felt heavier than usual. The echoes of polite laughter still lingered in my ears, like the hum of an engine that refuses to die. I made tea and carried the cup to Martin's study, where sunlight cut through the curtains in narrow lines. The peony from last night had begun to wilt, its petals falling onto the ledger like fragments of silence. The phone rang just as I sat down. Lauren's voice came through, tight and uneasy. "Mom, Nate wants to stop by later. He said it's about simplifying some paperwork." I smiled to myself. "Simplifying," I repeated. "That's a popular word these days." "He says it's just housekeeping," she added quickly, "so there won't be confusion." "There won't be," I said calmly. "Tell him I'll be ready." When they arrived that afternoon, the air between them was already strained. Nate carried a folder tucked neatly under his arm, his smile too smooth for comfort. Lauren avoided my eyes, as if she'd rehearsed silence as her defense. I led them into the sitting room, where the fireplace crackled low and the scent of thyme drifted in through the open window. Nate placed the folder on the coffee table, his tone light. "Teresa, we just need your signature on a few updated forms. Routine estate authorizations. It'll help with the transfer of management. We can file it today." "Management?" I asked softly. He nodded. "Just until things settle. You've had a lot to handle. This will take the pressure off you." Lauren's hands twisted in her lap. "It's just paperwork, Mom." I opened the folder. The first page bore the title, Power of Attorney, Limited Transfer. My name appeared in block letters, followed by Nate's as the designated agent. The text was clean, professional, and dangerous. I see, I said, turning each page carefully. You've been busy. It's just protection, Nate insisted. For the family. I looked up slowly. For the family? Or for your investors? His smile flickered. You're reading too much into it. Old habit, I said. Numbers and clauses are my native language. He leaned forward, the salesman mask slipping. Teresa, please. This isn't a challenge. Just sign, and we can move forward without all the red tape. I set the folder down. Did you draft this yourself? He hesitated. Our attorney did. The same attorney who tried to access the trust account last week? Lauren's head snapped toward him. What? His jaw tightened. That was a misunderstanding. I rose, walked to my desk, and returned with a single sheet of paper. I laid it gently on the table. This is the timestamp from Harbor Bank's compliance log. 3:41 p.m. Wednesday. An attempt was made to alter correspondence addresses and access levels. It failed. Lauren stared at him, her voice barely above a whisper. You told me that was just a formality. He rubbed his forehead. It was. I was trying to streamline things. I met his eyes, steady and unflinching. Streamlining is another word for control, Nathan. You should know that by now. He laughed once, brittle and forced. You can't keep running everything forever, Teresa. Eventually, someone else has to take charge. Someone competent, yes, I said quietly. Someone honest. Lauren stood abruptly, the tension cracking her voice. Stop, both of you. She turned to me, tears welling. Mom, please don't make this harder. I'm not, I said. He is. She looked at her husband, searching his face for truth, and found none. Something shifted behind her eyes, small but visible, the beginning of doubt. I think, she said softly, we should go. Nate gathered the unsigned papers, shoving them back into the folder. His composure was gone now, replaced by something colder. You'll regret this, Teresa. Families fall apart over stubbornness. Families fall apart, I said, when trust becomes a weapon. They left without another word. I watched from the porch as their car disappeared down the winding road. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sea salt and wet leaves. Inside, the house exhaled, and I let it. That evening, an email arrived from an anonymous address, short, unsigned, but unmistakably Lauren's. It contained one attachment, a scanned copy of a conversation between Nate and his attorney about refinancing my property. The message read only 3 words. I'm sorry, Mom. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the soft ticking of the old clock on the mantel. The needle of the compass glowed faintly in the moonlight, pointing north as always. For the first time, I felt the current of justice begin to turn in my direction. Not loud, not fast, but steady, like the tide against the seawall. I wrote a note in my ledger before bed. Paper reveals everything in time. Then I added the date and circled the number 8 in red ink. The following morning began with rain. Soft, rhythmic, and strangely reassuring. It painted the window panes in gray streaks, the kind of weather Martin used to call paper weather, perfect for getting things done quietly. I brewed coffee, placed the compass and Victor's letter in my bag, and tucked the trust documents into a waterproof folder. Today, the blueprint would take its next form, proof on public record. By the time I reached the county office, the rain had eased to a drizzle. The old building smelled of dust, ink, and damp wood. Clerks moved behind counters stacked with manila folders, their motions practiced and methodical. I waited patiently until one of them directed me to a private consultation room. Victor was already there, his gray suit, slightly rumpled, glasses fogged from the humidity. "Morning, Teresa," he said, standing to shake my hand. "You've chosen the right day. Fewer eyes, less noise." "I've learned that quiet work leaves the strongest marks," I replied. He smiled, a brief spark of pride in his eyes. "Then let's sign what must be signed." He opened a folder labeled Memorandum of Trust and Notice of No Encumbrance. The language was exact, airtight, and unmistakably his. "Once this is filed," he said, "any title search on the property will trigger a notice of restriction. No refinance, no lien, no sale, not without your direct consent. It's the legal equivalent of locking the harbor gate." I nodded. "Then let's close it." He placed the document on the table, slid a fountain pen toward me, and gestured to the signature line. My name looked small beneath the weight of all that text, but it held steady. I signed slowly, pressing down just enough to let the ink sink through the fibers. Victor leaned forward. "Now for the seal." He reached into his briefcase and produced a small brass stamper and a stick of red wax. The scent of beeswax filled the air as the stick melted under the flame of a match. I watched the thick drops fall, forming a perfect circle on the parchment. Then, with a steady hand, Victor pressed the stamper down. The wax hissed softly and hardened with a crisp edge. When he lifted the stamper, the impression shone against the dull paper, a lighthouse surrounded by waves. Martin's personal insignia. I touched it gently. He always believed structure could speak. "And now it does," Victor said. He blotted the corner of the page and slid it into a protective sleeve. "The recorder's office will file it today. By this afternoon, it becomes part of the permanent record." As he gathered his things, I said quietly, "Nate's been trying to outpace the law with speed. He doesn't understand that time favors those who build, not those who grab." Victor nodded. "Speed is chaos. Paper is rhythm. You've got rhythm on your side." When I stepped outside, the air was cool and clean. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under a pale sun. I walked slowly to the post office across the street and mailed a certified copy of the memorandum to myself. Martin's old habit for proof of record. The clerk stamped it with a solid clack, and the echo filled the small room like punctuation. Back home, I placed my filed copy in the drawer beneath Martin's compass. The faint scent of wax still lingered on my hands. I wiped the table clean, lit a small candle, and let the flame reflect off the brass rim. For a moment, the whole room glowed red and gold, like a signal from some distant lighthouse. That evening, Eloise stopped by with soup and gossip from town. "Word travels faster than wind," she said. "People are saying Nate's investors are nervous. Something about his paperwork being delayed." "Paperwork," I repeated with a smile. "Imagine that." She studied me with her librarian's patience. "You're not fighting loud, are you?" "I never do," I said. "Loud breaks things. Quiet rearranges them." Eloise laughed softly. "If silence were a sword, you'd have already won." After she left, I poured a small glass of sherry and sat by the window, watching the clouds drift toward the sea. The wax seal had cooled, solid and certain, its edges smooth as glass. I thought of Martin's phrase, "Wait until ink can speak." The ink had spoken today, and the record would echo long after words had faded. I opened my notebook and wrote in neat, steady letters, "Public record filed. Harbor locked. 9 days remain." Then, beneath it, one more line. "Justice doesn't roar. It signs." The notice came on Monday morning, typed neatly, sealed with the HOA emblem. It announced a special meeting to review wellness and guardianship concerns regarding homeowner Teresa Caldwell. I read it twice, the corners of my mouth tightening into something close to a smile. It was exactly the kind of move Nate would make after being blocked by law, a social petition dressed as concern. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the harbor, I walked across the cul-de-sac to the community hall. The building smelled faintly of coffee and varnish, chairs already set in rows. Familiar faces turned as I entered. Some nodded politely, others avoided my gaze. Hank Russo, the former police officer who chaired the board, stood near the podium adjusting his notes. "Evening, Mrs. Caldwell," he said with a nod. "Glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, settling into a seat near the front. The compass rested in my coat pocket, its weight a reminder of balance. A few minutes later, Nate arrived with Deborah and Lauren trailing behind. He looked composed, almost smug, carrying a slim folder that I knew contained little more than performance. Lauren's steps were hesitant, her eyes refusing to meet mine. Hank cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss concerns submitted by Mr. Nathan Pierce regarding Mrs. Caldwell's capacity to manage her property independently." The words rippled through the room like a mild shock. Deborah folded her hands neatly. Nate leaned forward as though preparing to deliver a closing argument. "With all due respect," Nate began, his tone feigned humility. "Teresa has been through a tremendous loss. I've noticed confusion, documents misplaced, unusual financial moves. We just want to make sure she's protected." Murmurs circled the room. I let them fade before standing. "Mr. Russo," I said evenly. "May I respond?" He nodded. "Go ahead, ma'am." I walked to the front table, each step measured. "Loss can make anyone quiet," I began. "It does not make them incapable. I am a retired accountant with 40 years of experience in estate management. I balance my own books, I sign my own papers, and I know every line of the bylaws governing this association." Hank's brow lifted slightly. "You do?" I smiled faintly. Section 4, Article 7, property rights remain unaffected by familial petition unless substantiated by medical incompetence. A few heads turned. Deborah shifted in her chair. "I have 2 physicians," I continued, "who certified my mental capacity last month. Their letters are notarized and on file. And since this meeting concerns transparency, I also brought documentation showing that I paid this association's annual fees 2 weeks early, in full." I handed Hank the printed receipt. The sound of paper sliding across the table filled the silence that followed. Eloise stood up from the back row. "I'd like to say something," she said. "Teresa volunteers at the library every Tuesday. She organizes the archives better than anyone half her age. If that's confusion, I hope I catch it soon." Laughter rippled softly through the room. Hank looked at Nate. "You got any medical documentation to back your claim, son?" Nate hesitated, glancing at Deborah. "Not yet. Then this hearing's premature," Hank said, closing his folder. "Mrs. Caldwell appears entirely competent. Case closed." A murmur of agreement spread among the members. Deborah lowered her head, lips pressed tight. Lauren's eyes flicked toward me, glistening, not with pity this time, but relief. As the meeting adjourned, Hank shook my hand. "You know the bylaws better than I do," he said with a grin. "I read them for comfort," I replied. "They're steadier than people." Outside, the night air was cool and clean. Lauren caught up to me near the steps. "Mom," she said quietly, "I didn't know he filed that petition, I swear." "I believe you," I said. "You can't control another person's fear." Tears welled in her eyes. "He said it was just procedure. It always starts that way." I touched her arm gently. "Just remember, procedure can cut both ways." From the doorway, Deborah watched us, but said nothing. For the first time, I saw the faint tremor in her composure, the beginning of understanding. When I returned home, The clock above the mantel ticked softly. I poured myself a cup of tea, still warm from the kettle, and stared at the wax-sealed envelope Victor had left on the desk. Justice, I thought, rarely needed to shout. It simply needed to appear, signed and filed, at the right moment. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Social hearing complete. Authority affirmed. 8 days remain." Then I closed it gently, letting the sound of the latch echo through the quiet house like the closing of a courtroom door. The morning began with the sound of the tide slapping against the seawall, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a clock counting down. I had 8 days left. The trust filings were secured, the deed untouchable, the bank sealed. All that remained was the medical pillar, the confirmation from Dr. Mehta and her partner to complete Martin's triad. After that, every door Nate could reach would be locked in ink. I drove to Dr. Mehta's office early, the compass in my coat pocket, its weight steady against my heartbeat. The rain had returned, soft but persistent, turning the streets into streaks of gray. Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of eucalyptus and old paper. Dr. Mehta greeted me with her usual calm smile, her eyes kind behind gold-rimmed glasses. "Teresa," she said warmly, "I received Victor's documents. Everything looks precise. You'll have both physicians' certifications by tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow?" I asked gently. "I thought we'd have them today." She sighed. "Dr. Leland had a family emergency. He's out of town for 24 hours. But don't worry, it's just a small delay. Nothing will fall through." I smiled faintly, though a chill crept through me. "I trust your word, doctor, but the system moves faster than conscience sometimes." She placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Martin's plan was clever. You're almost there. One more signature, and it's untouchable." On the drive home, the wind picked up, rattling the branches along the coastal road. The sound felt like pressure, an invisible hand reminding me that silence alone wasn't enough. Timing mattered too. I arrived to find a voicemail from Clara at the bank. Her tone was professional but taut. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is Clara. I need you to call me immediately. We received a notice from Pierce & Lowe Legal regarding a pending account review. They've tried to reopen a transfer request under a new timestamp. We have 48 hours before the compliance window closes automatically. Call me when you can." I called her back at once. "Clara, this is Teresa." "I'm glad you reached me," she said. "I've frozen all external requests, but we need a capacity letter on file to finalize the permanent block. Without it, the directive reverts to standard after 48 hours. My mind calculated quickly. Dr. Leland's delay meant his signature wouldn't arrive until after the deadline. "I'll handle it," I said firmly. "Please keep everything sealed." She hesitated. "You have 48 hours, Mrs. Caldwell. No extensions. Then 48 hours will be enough." After I hung up, I called Victor. He answered on the second ring. "Teresa, what happened?" "Medical certifications delayed," I said. "Dr. Leland's out of town. The window closes before he returns." He swore softly under his breath. "Of course it does. Listen. Clara can hold the line if we get provisional confirmation from one physician and a notary by tomorrow evening. Can you manage that?" "I can." "Good. I'll draft an interim affidavit tonight. You'll need Dr. Mehta to sign it in person, and I'll arrange a mobile notary. We'll file before the window closes." His voice steadied me. "You've done this before," I said. "Too many times," he replied, "but never with anyone as prepared as you." That night, I sat at Martin's desk with the compass open, the needle glowing faintly in the lamplight. The storm outside pressed against the windows. For a moment, fear brushed my skin, the quiet panic of realizing how close the line still was. I whispered to the compass, half prayer, half promise. Wait until ink can speak, I said. We're almost there. At dawn, I met Dr. Mehta again, the rain tapering to mist. She read Victor's affidavit carefully, then signed her name in firm, deliberate strokes. This will hold, she said. I'll fax it directly to Clara's office. By the time they test that window, the paper will already be stronger than the request. By noon, Clara called back. Received it, she said. Provisional verification filed. The system recognized the physician's authentication. You've bought yourself protection until the second letter arrives. Good, I said quietly. Let them try again. That evening, the second email arrived, from Lauren. Just a single line this time. I sent you proof of the refinance request. He doesn't know I did. Attached was a screenshot. Nate's internal message to his lawyer. Move before she locks health. Once she gets the doctors, we're finished. I stared at the screen until the tide noise returned in my ears. Then I printed it, folded it neatly, and slid it into the folder with Victor's affidavit. Paper had become both shield and sword. When the last light faded from the sky, I wrote in my ledger, Mini storm past. Structure holds. 7 days remain. Then I blew out the candle and let the sound of the sea remind me that justice, like the tide, always returns at its own pace, slow, inevitable, and stronger each time it's delayed. The courthouse stood on the edge of town, a gray stone building older than most of Newport itself. The morning wind off the harbor carried the scent of sea salt and wet pavement, and as I climbed the front steps, I felt the familiar steadiness that comes before balance is restored. Inside, marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights. Every sound echoed, the tap of my shoes, the rustle of paper, the low murmur of waiting voices. Victor met me by the security desk, a folder tucked beneath his arm. His suit looked sharper than usual, but the faint lines around his eyes gave away the late nights. Everything's ready, he said quietly. We'll go second on the docket. The judge assigned is sharp and doesn't tolerate theatrics. Perfect, I said. The truth doesn't need theatrics. We walked into the courtroom together. Nate was already there, sitting beside his attorney, who looked too confident for the evidence he didn't have. Deborah sat in the back row, her pearls motionless against a black dress. Lauren entered moments later, avoiding everyone's eyes, her face pale but composed. The bailiff called the case, and the hum of whispers faded into silence. The judge adjusted his glasses, eyes moving between us. Petition for guardianship over Mrs. Teresa Caldwell, he read aloud. Filed by Nathan Pierce, son-in-law. Grounds: alleged incapacity and potential financial mismanagement. Response filed by Mrs. Caldwell through counsel, Mr. Victor Henley. We'll hear opening statements. Nate's attorney rose first, voice smooth, well-practiced. Your Honor, this is a simple matter of protection. Mrs. Caldwell is recently widowed, emotionally compromised, and in possession of significant assets. My client merely seeks oversight to ensure the family's financial safety. Victor didn't flinch. When it was his turn, he stood slowly, speaking in his measured tone. Your Honor, this case is not about protection. It's about possession. Mrs. Caldwell's husband established an irrevocable trust, naming her sole authority. Her assets are secure, her documents intact, and her faculties certified by 2 licensed physicians. The only threat to this estate stands on the other side of this table. The judge raised an eyebrow. Do you have proof of these claims? Yes, Your Honor, Victor said, sliding a folder across the bench. 3 pieces. First, the compliance directive from Harbor Bank blocking any unauthorized access. Second, the notarized medical certifications confirming capacity. Third, A series of time-stamped emails showing that Mr. Pierce attempted to initiate financial changes using counsel under false representation. The judge leafed through the documents, the sound of paper crisp and final. "Mr. Pierce," he said, turning his gaze, "did you attempt to modify these accounts?" Nate shifted in his seat. "I acted on legal advice. I thought—" "Answer the question," the judge said firmly. Nate hesitated, then muttered, "Yes." A pause filled the room. The judge set the papers down and leaned back, studying me. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you wish to make a statement?" I rose, every movement deliberate. "Only this, Your Honor. Silence isn't surrender. It's a design. My husband built systems that speak louder than words. I've simply chosen to let them finish their sentence." For a moment, even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum softer. The judge nodded once, his expression unreadable. "The petition for guardianship is denied," he said. "All control and decision-making authority remain with Mrs. Caldwell. Furthermore, this court acknowledges her competence and the validity of the documents provided. Case dismissed." A gavel struck wood, sharp and clean. Nate's attorney gathered his papers in silence. Deborah's eyes glistened. She reached for her son's arm, but he pulled away. Lauren sat motionless, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. I turned toward her as I left the stand. Our eyes met for a heartbeat, hers full of shame, mine full of quiet forgiveness. Outside, the air was bright and cold. Victor joined me on the courthouse steps. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "The judge quoted your line in the dismissal record." "What line?" "Silence isn't surrender. It's a design." I exhaled slowly. Then the design held. "It did," he said. "And for the first time in a long time, justice signed its name without shouting." I looked up at the courthouse windows reflecting the winter light. "Martin would have liked that," I murmured. "He always said a signature is just a lighthouse made of ink." Victor smiled. "He was right, and today it shone bright enough for everyone to see." As we walked to the car, I glanced down at the folder in my hands, the embossed seal catching the sunlight. It looked almost like the wax mark we'd pressed in the county office, red against white, firm and final. When I reached home, I set the ruling beside Martin's compass and poured myself a cup of tea. The steam rose in slow spirals, curling like ink lines on parchment. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Court petition denied. Authority sealed. 6 days remain." Then I added one more sentence beneath it, one Martin would have written himself. "Justice doesn't roar. It signs." The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world scrubbed clean. The air outside carried the scent of salt and cedar, sharp and alive. I walked through the house in slippers, tracing my fingers along the doorframes, the way Martin used to check a structure for stability. The walls felt solid again, as if the house itself had exhaled after the ruling. That afternoon, a locksmith arrived, a quiet man named Robert with kind eyes and a toolbox that rattled like a chest of old secrets. "Full replacement?" he asked. "Every lock," I said. "Every door, gate, and latch." He nodded and went to work, the steady click and turn of metal filling the rooms like an unspoken hymn. I watched him move methodically from door to door, his hands sure and careful. Each new key he cut gleamed under the afternoon light, sharp and precise. When he finished, he placed a small envelope in my palm, 10 keys bound by a brass ring. "Fresh starts," he said simply. I smiled. That's exactly what they are. Not long after he left, I heard a car pull into the drive. It was Lauren. She stepped out slowly, wearing a soft gray coat, her expression careful but hopeful. She looked older somehow, less like a daughter seeking approval, and more like a woman learning to stand on her own. Mom, she said as she approached, I wanted to talk. Come in. She followed me into the kitchen, where the afternoon light poured across the table, illuminating the compass and the new keys. She noticed them immediately. You changed the locks. Yes, I said. It was time. She sat down, folding her hands. I came to tell you something before you hear it from someone else. Nate and we're separating. I nodded once, letting her find her pace. I found out about the refinance plan, about the messages to his lawyer. He said it was just business, but it wasn't. It was greed. I kept pretending I didn't see it because I wanted peace. But peace built on denial isn't peace. It's paralysis. Her voice trembled on the last word. I reached across the table and touched her hand. You saw what you needed to see when you were ready, I said softly. Tears welled in her eyes. I should have believed you sooner. I thought your silence meant surrender. My silence, I said, was preparation. She smiled through the tears. I know that now. We sat quietly for a moment, the sound of the waves in the distance like a heartbeat. Then she glanced at the keys on the table. You're not giving up the house, are you? No, I said. I'm reclaiming it. She nodded, her expression resolute. Then I want to help. I've told Nate I'm leaving the business. I'll sign whatever agreement you need to protect what's yours. I rose, walked to the counter, and picked up one of the new keys. It was small, with a clean brass finish that caught the light. I placed it gently in her palm. When your hands are clean, I said, the key will turn. She closed her fingers around it, a quiet sob escaping her. Thank you. Don't thank me, I said. Just use it wisely. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, not about the past, but about the future. She asked about Martin's designs, about the trust, about Quiet Harbor, the community center he'd once dreamed of supporting. I showed her the plans, the donation draft, the letter from Carmen Varela thanking me for the proposal. Lauren's eyes softened as she read. This is beautiful, Mom. You're turning everything that hurt into something that helps. That's the only kind of victory worth having, I said. Before she left, she hugged me tightly. For the first time in years, it wasn't the embrace of guilt or obligation. It was reconciliation, quiet and real. When the door closed behind her, I walked through the newly locked house. Each keyhole gleamed faintly in the golden light. I paused by Martin's study, turned one of the new keys in its lock, and listened to the soft click. It sounded like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. I wrote in my notebook that evening. Locks changed, boundaries restored, forgiveness offered, 5 days remain. Then, before closing it, I added a single line beneath, clean hands open every door. The next morning, the wind carried a gentler sound, no longer the harsh slap of waves, but the quiet hum of a tide returning home. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the wooden floor where Martin's study began. I hadn't opened his desk drawer since the day after the funeral. It still smelled faintly of cedar and ink, the scent of his steady patience. I sat down and ran my hand across the smooth surface of the old drafting table. Underneath the stack of sketches, I found a sealed envelope marked in his handwriting, for Teresa, when the compass stops trembling. I smiled faintly. It was just like him to give instructions that sounded like riddles. The compass on the desk, its brass lid closed for days, lay perfectly still now. The needle pointed north without a quiver. I broke the seal. The paper inside was thick, slightly yellowed around the edges. His handwriting filled the page, precise and familiar. My dearest Teresa, if you're reading this, it means the noise has passed. I built the trust, the deed, the clauses, all of it. not because I didn't trust you, but because I trusted the world too little. I wanted a system that would hold when hearts falter. You were always the quiet half of our design, the one who measured before speaking. That patience was your strength. I knew one day it would be tested. The compass was mine when I began my first project. It never pointed true. It trembled, always a few degrees off. You used to tease me for keeping it, said it was useless. But it reminded me that even flawed instruments can find direction when guided by steady hands. When I'm gone, let ink speak for us. Let paper guard what words can't. And when it's done, when silence has done its work, don't let bitterness claim what we built. You are the fortress, Teresa. You always were. Wait until ink can speak. Then, let light in. Martin. I read it twice before setting it down. For a long time, I simply sat there, tracing the indentation of his pen strokes, feeling the calm that his words carried even from beyond his years. The compass sat beside the letter, still and gleaming. I lifted it and placed it under the glass frame on the desk. The brass caught the light like a small sun. Outside, the gulls circled the shore. The house seemed to breathe differently now, less guarded, more alive. I walked to the window, looking out toward the horizon where the sea met the sky. For months, that line had felt like a boundary. Today, it looked like a promise. Eloise stopped by in the afternoon, bringing a basket of lemons from her garden. "You look lighter," she said, studying me. I opened the letter, I told her. She smiled knowingly. Martin always did like saving his best words for last. We sat together for a while, sipping tea. The air smelled of salt and sun-warmed wood. "Do you know what I realized?" I said quietly. "He never asked me to fight. He asked me to build, and that's what I intend to do now." Eloise nodded. "Then build something that outlasts even silence." After she left, I took the letter to the living room and framed it beside the compass. Underneath, I placed one of Martin's favorite blueprints, a sketch of a lighthouse he never got to finish. The base was labeled Quiet Harbor. The evening light spilled across the glass, catching the ink just enough to make his signature shimmer faintly. It looked alive. I could almost hear his voice, calm and certain. "You are the fortress." I closed the room and let the door click softly behind me. In the hallway, the air felt warm, filled with something close to gratitude. I wrote in my notebook, "Letter opened, compass stilled, design revealed, 4 days remain." Then, at the bottom of the page, I wrote one final line. "Even flawed compasses find true north when held by love." The following week began with a letter from the city council. It was short, formal, and stamped with approval. The Quiet Harbor Community Center project was officially cleared for development. I read it twice before letting myself exhale. The ink was barely dry, but it carried the final note of Martin's blueprint, the one we had always dreamed would outlive us. By late morning, I stood on the vacant lot near the marina where the center would rise. The space smelled of ocean air and new beginnings. Carmen Varela, the director who'd spent years running programs out of borrowed church rooms, waved as I approached. Her face glowed with genuine gratitude. "Teresa," she said, "I still can't believe it's happening." "It's happening," I told her, smiling. Martin wanted a place that taught people how to protect themselves, with knowledge, not fear. We'll start there. The architects had marked out the first boundaries with white stakes and string. It was modest now, a classroom, an office, and a small library, but the plans held more than bricks and beams. Quiet Harbor would host free workshops for seniors about estate rights, medical directives, and recognizing financial exploitation. Carmen walked me through the details as gulls swooped overhead. "Do you know what you're doing, Teresa?" she asked. "You're turning defense into education. You're giving everyone what you fought for, without them needing to fight. I smiled. That's the point. Justice doesn't have to roar. It can teach. Later that afternoon, I stood inside the half-framed lobby as workers prepared the plaster wall for an inscription. I'd asked for one line, something that would speak quietly for generations. When the stencil arrived, the mason nodded for my approval. I watched as he traced the words into wet cement, slow and deliberate. Justice doesn't roar, it signs. The letters gleamed in the light, shallow but permanent. I ran my fingertips across them, feeling the texture of truth pressed into stone. Deborah stood a few feet behind me, unexpected but not unwelcome. She wore no pearls today, only a gray shawl that softened her usual sharpness. I heard about this place, she said. Lauren told me. It's good. Good, I echoed. That's a word that still has meaning. She hesitated before speaking again. I didn't see it before. I was so afraid of losing face that I didn't notice what my son was becoming. I suppose silence can be a mirror too, if you know how to look. It can, I said quietly. The kind that reflects, not hides. Deborah's eyes glistened. You were never trying to destroy him, were you? No, I said. I was trying to save what was left of us. Sometimes justice just means closing the wrong doors before they burn the right ones. She nodded slowly, as if the words settled somewhere deep. He's left town, said he needs time. Then let him find it, I said. We all need time to see clearly. For a moment, the two of us stood side by side, watching the workers smooth the final layer of plaster over the wall. The scent of salt water and wet cement mixed in the air. Deborah wiped at her eyes. You've built something beautiful here, she whispered. It's not finished, I replied. Neither am I. Before she left, she turned once more toward the wall. Justice doesn't roar, she repeated softly, almost to herself. It signs. Maybe I'll remember that. As the sun began to set, Carmen handed me a small plaque for the entryway, engraved with the donors' names. Mine was last on the list, just beneath Martin's, Teresa Caldwell, founding benefactor. The letters shimmered faintly in the amber light. When the workers packed their tools and the lot emptied, I remained for a while, the wind lifting strands of my hair. The horizon burned gold over the water, the same color as the wax seals we once pressed by hand. I could almost feel Martin's presence there in the air, steady, approving, proud. Before leaving, I placed a single white peony at the base of the wall and whispered, "We built something that doesn't need to speak loudly to be heard." That night, at home, I opened my notebook and wrote, Quiet Harbor funded, legacy grounded. Deborah saw. 3 days remain. Beneath it, I added, justice, when true, sounds like calm breathing after a storm. By the third morning, the house smelled of spring rain and lemon oil. The locksmith's new keys gleamed on the hook by the door, small suns catching the light. Outside, the garden had begun to bloom again. The peonies Martin planted years ago were opening, slow and deliberate, as if they, too, understood timing. I put on my coat and walked the narrow path to the greenhouse, now converted into what the neighborhood called the garden library. Eloise had helped me organize it, donating books from the town archives. Rows of spines lined the shelves. Elder Rights Act, Financial Guardianship Procedures, Lighthouses of New England. It smelled of paper and rosemary. I placed a framed copy of Martin's letter on the desk near the window, beside a small vase of thyme sprigs. The morning light touched the ink just right, and for a moment the page seemed to breathe. Lauren arrived soon after, carrying a folder of signed documents. I stopped by Victor's office, she said, her voice steadier now. Everything's finalized, the separate property agreements recorded. Nate can't touch anything. not your assets, not mine. I took the folder from her, scanning the notarized pages. You did this yourself? She nodded proudly. Clara helped. She said to tell you she's drafting an article for the Rhode Island Herald about the new compliance directive program. She's calling it Elder Rights Week. That's good, I said softly. Information is protection. Lauren smiled faintly. She said you inspired it. I only reminded her that justice should leave a paper trail, I said. We sat together for a while, watching the light shift across the room. The smell of rain still lingered, mingled with ink and earth. For the first time, I saw ease return to my daughter's posture. The tension that had once clung to her shoulders was gone. Mom, she said after a moment, are you angry with him? With Nate? I paused, choosing my words carefully. Anger is expensive. It drains what should be used for living. He's already paying his own price, just not the one he expected. What do you mean? His investors pulled out. His accounts were frozen when Clara's directive flagged the irregularities. He's learning what happens when ambition runs faster than ethics. Lauren looked down. He blames himself? He should, I said gently. But one day, he might understand that failure can build something honesty never had the chance to. She exhaled slowly. I hope he finds peace. So do I said, but not before he learned structure. We laughed quietly, the sound soft but full of relief. Later, we stepped outside to the garden, where the air shimmered with the scent of salt and green things. Lauren knelt to tie back a branch heavy with blooms. You were right, she said, about silence. It isn't emptiness. It's engineering, I replied. The breeze lifted a petal from the nearest peony, carrying it across the grass. Will you keep living here? She asked. For a while, I said, until the house finishes teaching me. She looked at me curiously. Teaching you what? That grief and grace can share a roof. She nodded slowly, understanding without needing to ask more. When she left, I lingered in the garden, listening to the quiet. The world felt balanced again. Not perfect, not triumphant, just level. That was enough. I returned to the library, where the compass rested beside the books. The needle pointed north, unwavering. On the wall above it, I hung a small sign I had carved myself. Paper guards truth. Silence keeps it safe. I opened my notebook one more time and wrote, Lauren free. Rights recorded. Quiet harbor expanding. 2 days remain. Then I added a final line. Sometimes the best inheritance is understanding how to stand alone. The wind rose again on the 5th night, strong enough to rattle the windows. It came in from the Atlantic like an old visitor who had forgotten how to knock. I was reading in the living room, the compass glinting under lamplight, when the motion sensor outside clicked on. Through the sheer curtains, I saw the silhouette of a man standing at the gate. Still, uncertain, framed by the silver light of the porch. I didn't need to see his face. I knew the shape of that hesitation. I slipped on my coat and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold, salted, almost electric. Nate stood beyond the fence, his hands buried in his pockets, his hair whipped by the wind. His car idled at the end of the drive, headlights dimmed. He looked smaller than I remembered. Teresa, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I just wanted to see the house. You've seen it before, I answered, my tone even. Many times. Not like this, he murmured, not when it's truly yours. The porch light flickered once, the old wiring humming like memory. I didn't move closer. You chose your path, Nate. I did, he said, and I broke it. He looked down at the gravel, his shoes damp from the mist. They froze my accounts. The investors pulled out. It's all gone. Everything I thought I built. It wasn't real. The paper told you so, I said quietly. He managed a faint, bitter laugh. You and your paper. Paper doesn't lie, I replied. Only people do. He lifted his gaze, eyes hollow but sober. You were never trying to ruin me, were you? I shook my head. No, Nate. I was protecting what Martin built, and what you might have if you ever learn what real structure means. He stepped closer to the gate, but didn't cross it. I wanted to hate you, he said. But I can't. You didn't shout, didn't humiliate me. You just signed. Lighthouses don't shout at ships, I said. They just keep shining until someone finally sees. He looked past me toward the windows, where the compass glowed faintly on the desk. He'd be proud of you, Nate whispered, and ashamed of me. That's not for me to decide, I said, but it's not too late to start building something honest. He nodded, eyes wet in the wind. You always talk like the tide, because I've learned it always comes back. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind roared softly between us, carrying the faint scent of time from the garden. Then he turned toward his car. Goodbye, Teresa, he said. Good night, Nate. He hesitated one last time. Tell Lauren I'm sorry. She already knows, I said. She learned from you what not to lose. He looked down, nodded, and walked away. The gate stayed locked, and I didn't move to open it. The headlights dimmed and disappeared down the road, swallowed by darkness and distance. When I stepped back inside, the house felt warm again. The compass needle had stilled, its glow steady. I placed my hand on the glass, whispering the words I had waited months to say. It's done, Martin. Lauren appeared at the hallway, wrapped in her robe, her hair tousled from sleep. Was that him? Yes, I said. Did he? No. I smiled faintly. He finally understood. She came to stand beside me, her eyes on the compass. He finally saw what I've seen all along, she said softly. Your silence was never weakness. I nodded. Silence was the architecture. Lauren looked around the room. The books, the seals, the documents framed like small acts of faith. What will you do with all the keys? She asked. I reached for the wooden display case I had prepared for Quiet Harbor. Inside, the brass keys gleamed under glass, each one labeled home, gate, safe, library, trust. I closed the lid gently. Keys guard doors, I said. Ink guards dignity. Outside, the wind softened. The sea hummed again in its endless rhythm, neither angry nor calm, simply certain. That night, I wrote my final entry before the end. He came. He saw. Nothing more was needed. One day remains. Then beneath it, I added, some storms end not with thunder, but with understanding. The morning broke soft and pale, the kind of quiet that comes only after long storms. The horizon glowed the color of warm pewter, and the sea breathed evenly again. I woke early, made coffee, and walked barefoot through the hall. The house felt lighter now. No tension hiding in the corners. No echoes waiting to return. On the entry table sat the display case, the keys, the wax seal, and Martin's compass beneath glass. Together, they looked less like trophies and more like instruments of peace. The red wax still caught the morning light, its imprint, a lighthouse ringed by waves, unchanged. The mail arrived around 10. Among the bills and circulars was a single cream envelope, the handwriting unfamiliar. The return address read simply, Quiet Harbor, Atten, Director. I opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter, written in delicate cursive. Mrs. Caldwell, I don't know you, but I heard your story at Quiet Harbor's workshop. My son brought me papers to sign last month. He said it was just temporary guardianship. I almost did it. Then I read about what you built, about silence and signatures and strength. I didn't sign. I kept my home. Thank you for showing that quiet can still protect the brave. Eleanor J. I read the letter twice, then placed it on the table beside Martin's compass. The words shimmered faintly in the morning light, as if they carried his voice through someone else's hand. Later that day, I walked down to Quiet Harbor. The building was nearly finished now, the paint still fresh, the glass walls reflecting the tide. Inside, Carmen was setting up the display in the lobby, framed documents, photos from the workshops, and a small exhibit titled When Ink Speaks. She smiled when she saw me. "We saved a space for you," she said, "right by the main entrance." I handed her a small box wrapped in linen. Inside were the keys, the compass, and a sealed envelope stamped in red. She lifted the lid and inhaled softly. "They're beautiful. They tell the story better than words," I said. "They'll remind people that dignity isn't something given. It's signed." She nodded. "Would you like to write the dedication?" I took the pen she offered and wrote on the display card, "In memory of Martin Caldwell, who built structures that spoke. And for all who learn that silence can build too." When I stepped back, the sunlight caught the brass compass and cast its reflection against the glass wall. The words above the main entrance gleamed in gold. "Justice doesn't roar. It signs." Outside, the community garden had already begun to bloom. Carmen had planted olive trees along the walkway, "symbols of peace," she said. I reached up and wove a few leaves into a small wreath, tying it with a strand of white ribbon. The gesture felt simple, natural, complete. Before leaving, I stood by the shoreline behind the center. The tide was low, the air carrying the faint scent of thyme and salt. Lauren joined me, her hair pulled back, her eyes calm. "They're calling it the Caldwell Grant now," she said quietly. "Every year they'll fund legal aid for older residents." "Good," I said. "That means the story keeps moving." She slipped her hand into mine. "It already has." We watched the waves roll in, folding light over light. The world no longer felt heavy, just wide, steady, and honest. That evening, back home, I placed the olive wreath on the mantel beside the sealed letter. I lit one candle and let the flame reflect in the glass where the compass and wax seal rested. The house smelled of salt, ink, and calm. I opened my notebook for the last time and wrote, "Quiet Harbor complete, legacy alive, no days remain." Then beneath it, in a single deliberate line, "Justice doesn't roar, it signs." And when I closed the book, the sound was soft, like a door gently locking for the last time, keeping everything safe inside.